Welcome. My name is Joshua, here with a special guest, Director of MORIEL Ministries, Jacob Prasch. Jacob, thank you for joining us.
My blessing, my pleasure. Greetings in Jesus.
Yeah, so we're doing something a little bit different here today, and specifically because of the situation that we find ourselves in globally. We're living in a pretty unprecedented reality. And there's a lot of questions, less answers than there are questions. People are confused, and there's for every one sound voice, there's 1,000 chaotic ones. And so, given Jacob's background, especially his study in eschatological events, he's authored several books concerning end times and biblical prophecy, about the Antichrist, about the rapture of the church, about apostasy, and so forth. And so the goal, as always, is to root ourselves firmly in God's Word, the only rule of faith and practice. And so we find our answers ultimately in God's Word, and that's how we're going to make sense of the world around us. So that's the goal here, Jacob. Let's start here, just to kind of orient ourselves. We are constantly exhorted by Jesus. He constantly told his disciples to be alert, to be aware, to watch for things to come. See, I've told you these things beforehand that you might not stumble. And he told them these things beforehand that they might not be deceived. There's a real emphasis on them being alert, being aware, and watchful for things that were going to come. And on the other end of the spectrum, we do see in Isaiah chapter 8, not to call everything a conspiracy that these people call a conspiracy. And so with so many voices out there, some people overemphasizing and some people denying altogether, or at the very least under appreciating or underemphasizing. How do we strike that balance? And why is end times prophecy and eschatology important?
Well, if Jesus reiterates in the Olivet Discourse 3 times at least that we are to be alert, that's not an admonishment. That's a command. Jesus commanded us to be alert.
Good point.
In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, it was the same thing. Be alert. In the Hebrew Scriptures, we see Habakkuk, take your stand on the watchtower, and the commands to the watchman. Be alert, be alert, be alert. It's something God commands. Now, right away, Satan is going to attack what God commands. One of the ways Satan has attacked it, obviously, is the false teachings of hyperpreterists and of Rick Warren and the purpose-driven agenda. Rick Warren tells us, avoid end-time prophecy, it's a diversion. Jesus said, when you see these events happening, be alert, beware. This is the first time in history the Jews are back in their own land since the Babylonian captivity. Isaiah says there's only 2 regatherings. This has never happened before.
Right.
It makes this time in history different from the other times in history when believers thought it was the close of the age. Rick Warren says, keep away from that. You either believe Jesus Christ or you believe Rick Warren. You either believe the purpose-driven agenda or you believe the New Testament. Sadly, many Christians, even professing to be saved Christians, are believing Rick Warren instead of Jesus Christ. This is a problem. Right. Another is the hyperpreterists, who try to tell us all these events happened in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed and has no future meaning. In fact, the prophecies of Jesus and of Daniel, the prophet, were partially fulfilled in 70 AD. Christ did not return in 70 AD to establish his kingdom. It's absurd what they're saying. Not only that, but nothing worse would ever happen again. But worse things than 70 AD have happened both to the Jews and to the Christian church. Right. Despite the fact that Daniel and Jesus both said it's going to be unique, nothing this terrible will happen again. Worse things have happened since 70 AD. Not to minimize it, it's a type and a shadow of what will happen at the close of the age. So we see Satan attacking what God has commanded. Satan does not want believers and the true church to be ready for the return of Jesus. He wants them to ignore the reality and importance of these signs, so he's raised up messengers to deceive the church. If possible, the elect will be deceived. There's a third category of people. I don't say that they are deceivers, but I do say they are deceived themselves. People who take a radical pre-tribulational view of prophecy and the return of Christ, and they have a doctrine of imminency that says there are no signs for the return of Jesus.
Right.
It can happen at any moment. Therefore, events in the Middle East, although God may have his hand in it in some manner prophetically, it is not a sign of the return of Christ.
Right.
Or an increase in pestilence, it's not a sign of the return of Christ. Jesus did say specifically, these things are signs of his return. So from the pre-tribulationists, particularly the radical ones, from the radical preterists who say it was all fulfilled in the early church, and of course the Rick Warren agenda, these are things Satan is using to make the church blind to the reality of what's happening. And the coronavirus is only one manifestation of it.
Right. Yeah, Jesus spent so much time preparing his disciples that their faith wouldn't falter when the trial came. He promised them tribulation. He said, they will deliver you up to synagogues and scourge you and kill you. You'll be hated by all men. See, I've told you these things beforehand. Don't be surprised when it happens. And so it is unfortunate that in this overly idealistic and unscriptural idea that we're going to somehow have it better than every saint of every age in the past had it. We're going to be spared from the persecution that everybody had to suffer. That's a good point. Things to be aware of. But as you mentioned, we on the other hand, we have 1,000 voices urging people to be so aware of some things that are valid and other things that are absolutely absurd. And you have there's been a surge in interest in conspiracy theories, over the last decade especially. They've always been around. And we don't deny that there are real conspiracies, but you can take a mile when an inch is given pretty easily. And so, but you have these prominent voices like Alex Jones and David Icke and some others who get a lot of things right in terms of talking about globalism and so forth. But just as a question, is it possible for, I don't believe either of these men claim to be Christian, is it possible for lost men to get it right from time to time?
The Magi were not Hebrews, but they understood the signs of the time that Jesus was coming. God is going to use natural phenomena to draw people to Christ in faith and repentance in the last days. This is absolutely what happened in his first coming, and what will happen in his second coming. I'm amazed that there's people, many of them Jewish, Melanie Phillips, the journalist, Andrew Bolt, the journalist, Ben Shapiro, Dennis Prager, Mark Levin, Michael Savage, David Horowitz. Most of these people, not all of them, but most of them are Jewish, and they do see something happening. And they do see their only real friends are premillennial Christians, and they understand it, but they don't believe in Yeshua as the Messiah.
Right.
But they're not saved, but they understand that something unique is happening.
Right.
We need to pray for those people. Yes, God is showing unsaved people, and he's using these events to draw them to the truth that the true church holds. One of the advantages of this present mess and other messes that are coming, it's not the only one, it was not the first one, and it will not be the last, is that it will create evangelistic opportunities. This is what Jesus meant when he said, preach the gospel of the kingdom, using end-time prophecy and as a vehicle to share the good news of salvation. We live in a post-Judeo-Christian world, even a post-existential world. How do you evangelize people in a world that is post-existential, where apathy is rife, where Eastern religion has permeated Western spiritual thought. How do you evangelize people in this environment? Well, you use end time prophecy. Understand the Lord is allowing these events to happen for a reason, to draw the unsaved to faith in Jesus and to the message that the true church has.
Amen. And we are. This is quite an unprecedented event. Never before have we seen the globe effectively shut down. We've got a virtual media blackout in terms of coverage. I think last week alone was about 6.5 million Americans filed for unemployment. The whole world has never seen anything like this. Not in my lifetime. I don't think in your lifetime. Not in my grandmother's lifetime.
Well, let's look at this.
Yeah.
It's not unprecedented if we take a long historical view. The bubonic plague, the Black Plague in the Middle Ages, wiped out between 1/4 and 1/3 of Europe's population.
Right.
Many believers who were persecuted at that time before the Reformation. There was terrible persecution of Christians in England, like the Lollards, the followers of John Wycliffe, of the Bohemian Brethren, and the Waldensians. There were always believers before the Reformation. The persecution of believers and the anti-Semitism, the pogroms against the Jews. Many believers think that, or thought that what happened with the bubonic plague was God's judgment against the woman Jezebel. I will throw her on a deathbed and kill her children. It historically happened that between 1/4 and 1/3 of Roman Catholic Europe was wiped out. Now, this is the biggest plague scare since that time. Right. I'm not saying that many people are dying, but in terms of its impact, it's the biggest since the Black Death of the Middle Ages.
Right.
We have to understand that. However, when we use the term unprecedented, if you're defining it narrowly as a plague, you can say that. But let's look at the previous 2 major disasters that have changed the world permanently.
Right.
One was obviously September 11th, and 2 was 2018. In both of those things, we saw what the governments, what the mainstream media, what the establishment, and the financial institutions all did. We saw it after September 11th, and we saw it with the subprime collapse of 2008.
2008, right.
The world has never been the same economically since 2008. It has never been the same strategically since 2001, September 11th. What governments did then is what governments are doing now. They are manipulating the crisis to erode democracy and to centralize control, to protect the banksters and to advance their agenda that ultimately, of course, will be used against the body of Christ and against Israel. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not saying there are men planning to do this. I'm not saying that the Club of Rome or the Bilderbergers or the Illuminati or the Freemasons or the Trilateral Commission are planning to do this. What I am saying is they are responding to events for which they are in large part responsible in such a way as to protect and advance their own interests. But Satan has an agenda.
Right.
Satan is using these things to set the stage for Antichrist. Satan is.
Right. There is a real satanic conspiracy.
There is a satanic conspiracy we see in the book of Daniel.
Right.
With the little horn to bring the Antichrist to power. Now, I'm not saying all the players in the international power structure of the corporate world and banking and government are cognizant of what they're doing.
Right. Yeah, they're not. Right.
But I am saying the world is in the power of the wicked one. There's this demonic spirit on back of it. And now that the Western world is post-Judeo-Christian, there's nothing really much stopping it from happening.
Right.
We have to understand what God is doing, but understand what the devil is doing without being trapped in conspiracy theories.
Right.
Perhaps later I can elaborate more about what governments did after September 11th and after 2008 in contrast to what they're doing now, which is basically the same kind of response.
Yeah, we should analyze some of those things here in just a bit and compare what some of the things that have already transpired to things that have. And what I meant by unprecedented was really the global response to this and
Yes.
the shutting down of global institutions effectively, travel bans. We've really never seen anything that has brought the entire world to a halt effectively. And because of that, it's impossible for people not to take an interest in it. People have lost their jobs. There's millions of people out of work. They're uncertain about how this is going to impact them in the future financially. It's really it's a time of uncertainty and wanting to be factual. You know, I made a video about a week ago analyzing just the facts and questioning why we have responded the way we have responded even several weeks ago. So it's no question that this is a real virus and people are really dying, and it's affecting people directly and indirectly worldwide. That's not a question. We're not denying that. We're not saying this is a hoax, not by any stretch. What I find interesting is, for example, according to the World Health Organization and the CDC, annually, there is a margin of variance for influenza-related deaths of about 360,000 people. That's the margin of variance. It varies between 290,000 to 650,000 people a year. So they anticipate that there could, give or take, 360,000 people may or may not die. In 1 year, if 290,000 people die, and the next year 650,000 people die, that wouldn't be a blip on the radar. They anticipate that. That's a massive margin of variance to take into account, not denying what is happening, but as of today, worldwide coronavirus deaths are about 55,000. That's a large number, but taking into account the global population, comparatively, it's not. And that's not to say that it won't get worse. We don't know. It is to say that given our response thus far in light of what it is curious. It is curious given the influenza-related deaths on a yearly basis.
More people are dying from ordinary flu right now than from coronavirus.
Right.
More are dying right now from ordinary flu.
Right.
And that happens every year. The question is, what makes the coronavirus unique?
Right.
Is there something microbiologically, or is there something of a more sinister nature? That's the question.
Right. Yeah, it is. It is. And, you know, another statistic that is interesting to take note of is the abortion statistic. I think the World Health Organization estimates that every 24 hours worldwide, approximately 125,000 abortions.
That's right.
Every single day. You can watch the counter, and it's about 2 a second.
And the world doesn't consider these to be deaths.
Right.
But God does.
Right. So it's interesting that so many of the people and even the legislatures that are enacting some pretty radical measures to in the interest of public health and public safety, some of these same people are championing the fact that every year in America alone, there's over 600,000 abortions.
It's not only that, but there's been litigation in the United States by Planned Parenthood, where states are stopping all non-emergency related surgical procedures because they need the hospital facilities to cope with the potential pandemic effects from the coronavirus. And this is causing a temporary cessation of most abortions, unless it was an ectopic pregnancy or something,
right.
A medical emergency abortion, to save the life of the mother. Abortions are not happening. They are litigating in at least 6 states, and you have left-wing judges, mainly appointed by the Obama administration or by Clinton, who are saying, despite the virus and despite the fact that the hospitals don't have to allow for other kinds of surgery, we
Right.
have to allow for abortions. This is how corrupt and godless it is. This is God's judgment.
I was going to say it almost sounds like we're begging for God's judgment.
Yes.
The way we um, emphasize certain things, and we elevate woe to those who call good evil and evil good.
Evil good,
This
yes.
has got to be the epitome of that situation. But it is interesting to take a look at the reaction globally in light of the numbers, and you can places like Italy that have been especially hit hard. It's almost understandable to an extent, and one of the things that I've mentioned is that habitual and targeted reporting does not alter global statistics, but it does alter your perception of the global
Yes.
statistics. And when I mentioned this margin of variance, 360,000 is a massive margin of variance from year to year. And all that to say that if we weren't hearing about this every 3 seconds, there's virtual media blackout concerning this. If you weren't hearing about this, unless the coronavirus death toll in a year's time was greater than 360,000, you wouldn't even know that it happened, because it would just be chalked up to an
Correct.
influenza-like illness, an ILI. It's that's pneumonia related. You have flu-like symptoms and you would die. But with a margin of variance of 360,000, we never even think about these things. We had in 2017-2018 season in America alone saw 61,000 deaths, and that's primarily in a 4-month period from December
Yes.
to March. And it was peaking at about 4,000 Americans a week, which I think last week the total death tolls are approaching 5,000. I think it's about 4,700 in America, which is a lot, don't get me wrong, but it is marginally worse than it was 2 years ago in 2018 when almost nobody cared, and that was happening consistently for many,
Yes.
many weeks at a time. And so we don't want to trivialize what is, but looking at the numbers is certainly interesting.
It's certainly interesting, unless a case can be made biomedically and scientifically that there are characteristics of the coronavirus different than ordinary influenza that makes it potentially more destructive. For instance, the ability to communicate it to someone else while you yourself are asymptomatic, while you don't have the symptoms, but you're infected and don't know it and you can communicate it.
Right.
It also appears to induce pneumonia and have a higher rate of mortality than ordinary influenza for those who do get infected. But the overall figures are what you say.
Right.
The meaning of those figures in terms of the death rate, in contrast to ordinary influenza, shows that ordinary influenza is much more deadly, happens every year seasonally, all the way to early spring, from late winter, and most people don't think of it. Why is this happening now?
Right. Well, and let's assume that because on one hand, I've heard Dr. Anthony Fauci say, this is gonna peak for about a few weeks, maybe 3 to 6 weeks, and then it'll start dropping. The next day, he says, it's going to get worse before it gets better. I mean, you're hearing a lot of contradictory information, and
Yes.
it seems to change by the minute, and so it induces a lot of uncertainty with people. We don't really know what to make of this. And so it's possible, I heard some recent estimates that I think what they say up to 200,000 Americans could potentially die when it's all said and done. That's a staggering number.
Yeah, but a lot of, like ordinary influenza, a lot of them would be aged people and so forth,
Right.
or people who already have pulmonary diseases.
Right.
But let's look at something.
Yeah.
A major part of the problem you're describing with the statistics and conflicting analysis of the statistics is to do with the politicization of the pandemic.
Right.
We have to understand something. The pandemic and its ramifications, both for health and for the global economy. The World Bank is not primarily about economics. It's about the geopolitics of economics. It has an agenda. We have to understand that's true of all the central banks, the Federal Reserve Bank, the European Central Bank, etc. We also have to understand that the World Health Organization is not primarily about health and science. It is a politicized organ. Its present leadership, which is absolutely abysmal, are basically mouthpieces for the propaganda of the Chinese government. The Chinese government are largely responsible for this happening. It's China's gift to the world. They sequestered reporting for the first 5 weeks approximately concerning the coronavirus and have not been honest with their statistics ever since. One British bacteriologist, a major microbiologist, just a few days ago said the figures in China can be astronomically higher than the corrupt Chinese government is admitting. That it's declining and things like this. It's largely not true. In the opinion of many people, including some people who are independent in China. The whistleblower in China, a medical scientist and physician, he's disappeared. He's politically purged and arrested. This is the Chinese government who lied about the Olympics, who perpetrated open warfare against its citizens in Tiananmen Square and denied it happened after killing 7,500 people in front of 1.2 billion people watching on TV, and then denied it happened. You're dealing with people who have no scruples and no morals.
Right.
You're dealing with one of the most unscrupulous governments in human history, very much in the character of Stalin, Hitler, and Mao. It doesn't matter what they say, you can't believe it. But it's not only China. It's happened in the West. There's the politicization of this crisis in the United States in an election year.
Well, and so let's take a look at some of those, some of the effects of this coronavirus, some of the ways that this has apparently been exploited. And then we'll talk about how this plays into the biblical warnings we see about famine and pestilence. We want to ask some questions, and perhaps some questions people haven't thought of before concerning both famine and pestilence, because we're seeing elements of both of those in some way already. But so far, just a few. Here's a real short list of some of the things that have transpired in the last couple of weeks as a direct result of coronavirus. You had a former Prime Minister of Great Britain, Gordon Brown, calling for a one world government to help fight this. We can't do this individually. We need a global executive entity to corral this. In the initial draft of the United States stimulus package proposed by Nancy Pelosi, there was the introduction of a digital dollar and an e-wallet, digital currency, introducing blockchain to the American public. The final draft removed it. The language was still there, and we'll show some of these pictures from the websites. But then you got the digital dollar introduced. Now this is on the table, and the Federal Reserve is in control of this. It's a matter of time before that is reintroduced, but it's been formally introduced now, and they're talking about shifting to an electronic currency for convenience reasons. You also have what did pass in the final draft of the stimulus package in America, anyway, is the CDC's sponsored coronavirus surveillance and data collection, which we'll talk a little more about in a moment. Possible legislation Andrew Cuomo's talking about. I just read this morning that the president of the Philippines is instructing the police and the military to kill citizens, to shoot them on the spot if they refuse to obey coronavirus lockdown orders. You've had some religious leaders, we'll call them. I hesitate to use the word pastor. Some of them are rightly false teachers and hirelings. But nevertheless, religious gatherings, people have been arrested for gathering in some of these groups. There's a whole lot going on globally. And this is just a few of the ways that this has been politicized thus far. First of all, your take on Gordon Brown calling for a one world government. Is this surprising?
No, Gordon Brown is seen in Britain as a failed prime minister. He's a political failure. It was a disaster. He drained Britain of its gold reserves, of its bullion, and had nothing to show for it. He demolished the country's monetary mineral base. He was seen as a failure even by his own party, by Tony Blair, who did not want him to become prime minister. Now, what you have had in Europe is this. Politicians who fail to get elected were going to the EU by political appointment by their colleagues and friends from their parties. And they were getting senior bureaucratic positions where they could legislate bureaucratically without having to have any democratic accountability. That is the mentality of Europe, and it's the mentality very much of Gordon Brown. He just would like to see some international or multinational organ usurping the powers of Parliament, Congress, and things of that nature. Political failures resort to globalization to find a home. It's much like Hollywood has-beens, film stars who are past their sell-by date and they're no longer a box office draw, so they join some left-wing political cause and they become spokesmen for left-wing politics. The Hollywood has-beens. It's how they keep their name on in the media.
Right.
Well, political has-beens, electorally, like Gordon Brown, always look to some kind of supranational or international unelected bureaucratic power structure in order to have a position in the future. So that's just typical of Gordon Brown.
Well, unfortunately, I don't think Gordon Brown is the only one that is embracing this idea. But certainly, that's a good perspective. Tony
Blair's another one who's pushing it.
Right. Yeah, and this is, and we don't want to, because terms get hijacked, and when everything's the Antichrist, nothing's the Antichrist. When everything's the mark of the beast, nothing's the mark of the beast. And that's happened so much in the past that when a clearly catalytic moment in history that's taking place, the tendency can be to dismiss this as just another, a thoroughly inconvenient season. But, it says in the last days, mockers will come saying, where's this return? Where is he? Everything's continuing as it has.
Absolutely correct.
And so we do want to make it clear that we're not talking about fanciful ideas here. There is going to be a real man of lawlessness, a real son of perdition, who will really make war with the saints and overcome them eventually, it says.
The stage is being set for him right now.
Right. And perhaps more clearly than any other time. And that's
politically, economically, and in the sphere of ecumenism and interreligious unity.
Right. That's a really good point. And gosh, you and I have both talked at length about those trends, apostasy within the church and so forth. And as you've pointed out a number of times, 4 times more than anything else, Jesus warns about deception within the church as a clear sign of his return.
That's correct.
And these things have been happening right in front of us, and so it should be no surprise to the true believer in Jesus that, well, it rather appears that that there's the stage is really the light is kind of being turned on now. The stage has been set, and it seems like we've shifted gears in a lot of ways. And then we have this digital dollar. Again, not a new idea. It's been talked about for a long time, but to my knowledge, this is the first formal proposal, at least in America, that wasn't actually ratified, but it was formally proposed just a couple of weeks ago, a week and a half ago.
Going back to the special drawing rights, the SDRs of the 1970s, now coming forward to blockchain technology, Bitcoin, things of that nature. Central banks need to control the currency supply. And if computer technology makes it possible for there to be rival currencies, they have to have some way of getting control of those alternate currencies and integrating them into the economic mainstream of the international banking system. So, yeah, this is absolutely the case. But we understand, although it's not what they're planning or trying to do, ultimately these things are paving a way towards the mark of the beast.
Right. And pretty clearly so. Here's I'll just read a quote here from Forbes magazine. This is from Vipin Barthran, who's the chair of Hyperledger Identity Working Group. He said, "This is a significant step, and I argue that such crisis situations always produce new ideas and acceptance of new ideas that will live on long after the coronavirus has burned through the world." It reminds me of that quote from Rahm Emanuel, who said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste."
Correct.
So you can see how there's a readiness to exploit a crisis. Oh, suddenly people are going to be more likely to embrace new ideas. Not the least of reasons is they're scared and uncertain about what the future holds, and if this is going to help alleviate my stress and my worries, then people are more prone to embrace it.
Yes. Absolutely correct.
And okay, we've got what did pass in the United States stimulus bill anyway. Headline here from Business Insider says the CDC will set up a coronavirus surveillance and data collection system as part of the $2 trillion stimulus bill, which President Trump just signed into law. Forbes also covered this, highlighting that they are going to, and in fact are already, many local governments are already using the GPS systems in the phone to create a network that your local government can track your movements to see if you've maybe been in contact with somebody else who might have been in contact with somebody that had coronavirus. And the infrastructure has arguably been in place for quite some time, but now the government is going to be tapping into this. Not a new thing in China, for example, but this is kind of big news.
Well, again, banking regulations that were designed to stop the money laundering of drug money and of the funding of terror are used against ordinary citizens.
Right.
That is the way it works. And ultimately, they'll be used against Christians, of course. That is the plan of Satan. Let's understand something, what's happening now. We can only compare it to previous events. One thing you see is the real culprit gets a pass. In September 11th, Saudi Arabia, who funded Al-Qaeda, most of the bombers were Saudi Arabians, members of the House of Saud, the Saudi government funded it. Saudi Arabia got a pass. The Bush administration continued the express visa program for Saudi Arabians to come into the country for over a year after September 11th. Nobody held them accountable. Nobody froze their assets. And when 9/11 families, the victims, tried to sue the Saudi Arabians, James Baker from the Bush administration became their lawyer to fight these American families, because the Bush family was partnered through the Carlyle Group with the House of Saud. This is not conspiracy. It's simply fact. The culprit does not get the blame. The world's not been the same since 2008, since the subprime crash. The culprit didn't get the blame. None of the banksters were brought to justice. Now let's just look at the facts. These are the simple facts. Subprime lending was largely designed by Andrew Cuomo during the Clinton administration. It was Clinton who pushed this. His attorney general was threatening to litigate on grounds of civil rights abuse for institutions that would not lend money to people who are high credit risks. Subprime was a time bomb built by Andrew Cuomo, and the timer was set by Bill Clinton. It went off after he left the White House. Chris Dodd pushed it in the Senate. Barney Frank, who had a homosexual boyfriend on the board of Freddie or Fannie Mac, pushed it in the House. And when Bush finally woke up, and he and Hank Paulson, his Treasury Secretary, realized what was happening because Bush went along with it. The Republican Party establishment was shared in the blame. When the red light went off on the dashboard and Bush and Boston saw what was happening, it was Barack Obama who blocked any emergency legislation from stopping the subprime and intervening with Fannie and Freddie. Obama, Barney Frank, Andrew Cuomo, Bill Clinton, none of them got the blame for what they did. The culprits don't get the blame. Now it is the Chinese government. The Chinese government is responsible for the suppression of data in the first 5 weeks of the epidemic, when it was still an epidemic, that allowed it to become a pandemic. To the present moment, they are lying to their own people and lying to the world. One of the main problems with the statistics is we cannot trust or believe what the Chinese government says. We do not know anything, except if it comes out of their mouth, it's probably a lie.
Right.
But is the world blaming the Chinese government?
No, that would be racist. You can't do that.
That would be racist. Is the world blaming Andrew Cuomo, for 2008 and Barack Obama? No. Is the world, and Barney Frank? No. Is the world blaming the Saudi Arabians for September 11th? No. The culprits always get a pass. The establishment protects the culprits. The people get sold down the river. And the banksters always get bailed out. Under Barack Obama, you had the Fed giving loans at zero interest. Prime rate is zero to banks who are lending it out at 4 to 5%. This is just open corruption. But it was the policy of Barack Obama. Now, under Barack Obama, the average Afro-American family's income declined by $900. He bailed out the banksters of Wall Street. What did he do for his own people? Put them on the breadline? The culprits never get the blame. Well, the same thing is happening now that happened in September 11th. Same thing is happening now that happened in 2008. It's happening now with the corona pandemic. The culprits get a pass. Nobody is blaming the true guilty parties. The other thing that's happening is governments use it to erode democracy.
Right.
That's what happens. Instead of holding the Saudi Arabian government responsible, instead of having congressional investigation of the Council of American Islamic Relations, which need desperately to be investigated by Congress as an organization that needs to be banned, given the fact that so many of its officials were found by the Justice Department to be involved in raising money for terror. Restricting immigration from Islamic countries of people we couldn't vet. Revoking student visas of Islamic students from abroad engaged in radical Islamic political activity. The common sense things that should have been done were not done because, in part, the House of Bush, the Bush dynasty, the Saudi Arabians had them in their back pocket, obviously, and the same for the Clintons and so forth. The funding for the Clinton Library and Foundation came from the Gulf, largely, to a major extent. But let's look what happens. Instead, American citizens have the Patriot Act. They're deprived of their rights. You have to give up rights to search and seizure without a warrant in order to get on an airplane. And people, out of fear of terror, will forfeit those rights instead of what needed to be done, which was curbing Islamic immigration. They let that continue, resulting in more bombings like happened in San Bernardino, thanks to the Obama administration and the Clinton State Department. You let the culprits continue. You protect the culprits at the risk and expense of the people. That was 2008. That was September 11th. And that's what they're doing now. China gets a pass. Their company, Hawaii, whatever it's called.
Yeah, Huawei.
That should be,
Right.
Yeah, that should be banned globally.
Right.
It should be excluded from the G5,
Right.
but it's not being. The bad guys always get a pass. The consequences are put on to the working men and women and the ordinary citizens.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate too. In the what was intended to be a constitutional republic, which is arguably a more of a plutocracy at this point, the people, when the fear levels are high enough, it's almost like the people beg for oppression.
Of
It's almost
course,
I've seen even well-meaning Christians say things like, "We need martial law. We need this to keep us safe. You know, we need greater forms of oppression." And you know, in the wake of 9/11, you saw an unparalleled unity within the United States like never before. I remember that time. I was still in high school. Everybody was wearing American flag pins. Everybody was the tragedy unified a lot of people, and because of the scare factor, because you didn't know what was going on, there was very little objection to the Patriot Act, which was then added, built onto by the National Defense Authorization Act in the Obama administration, both of which were just systematical infringements on liberties. But it was all under the guise of safety, and
the same will be true of the coronavirus.
right, which is what's happened. People are going to say, no, we need to have our data collected for the sake of global safety. And what amplifies this threat is, terrorism was an enemy that was hard enough to define, but an invisible virus. I mean, what's more scary than something you can't see that potentially is floating around you? I mean, I got an email from a woman in Alberta, Canada, a couple days ago, saying that among the regulations they're putting on them is that even in their home meetings, they're not allowed to sing because singing might transfer the disease. And more radically, I think I mentioned just a moment ago, the president of the Philippines is now commanding the police and the military to shoot people dead who refuse the lockdown. And I anticipate a lot of people, as a result of their fear, are going to welcome that oppression in large part because if we don't, right, the thinking is, well, we're all going to die.
Let's look at the words of Jesus in this regard in Luke chapter 21, Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse.
Right.
Verse 10, he continued saying, "Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom." Nation is ethnon, racial wars, or wars of ethnicity. Okay, goy lagoy in Hebrew, ethnon in Greek. And basileia, kingdom against kingdom, malchut in Hebrew. Those are the political wars. So wars will be ethnic, racial, and political. You're going to see this racialization and an increase in ethnic conflict. And you're seeing it all over the world. It doesn't matter if it's the Uyghurs in China. It doesn't matter who it is. It's all over. The tribalism in Africa with the Hutus and Tutsis, you're going to see it everywhere. And there will be great earthquakes in various places, an increase in seismic activity, and plagues, the pestilences, of which the coronavirus is one. But then famines. Famines. The scripture tells us the coronavirus came suddenly. Famine is going to come. There's going to be food shortages even in the developed world. Now, we normally associated famines with either pestilences, plague, locusts, or blight, or drought,
Right.
some kind of natural cause. What happens when a virus causes a breakdown of the distribution infrastructure? And people who work for railways and supermarkets and trucking companies can't go to work except in limited numbers, and you're affecting the distribution. Even though the food is there, you can't get it to the consumer. Watch out. We are going to see this happen. You are also likely going to see these things that are synergistic. The food controlling companies of the world, the people who have the most control of grain, United States, Canada, Australia, those who are net food exporters. Argentina, that has major economic problems. They're going to use food the way that OPEC used oil if they can. It will come to that. The weaponization of food as a commodity. That's going to happen.
It appears it is happening in the Philippines even now. I think that's why
Even now.
they're protesting, because there's no rations coming for them.
I went to a supermarket last week in England. I thought I was in Venezuela. The shelves were stripped. You couldn't get, even staples were not there. You had to buy powdered milk and things like this. This was Britain. This was not Venezuela.
I thought you meant literal staples. I was wondering who's doing paperwork right now.
Now you begin to see why the people will follow the man who comes counterfeiting Christ on the white horse in Revelation chapter 6.
Right.
If someone comes along and says he can solve these problems and bring a sense of security, stability, and sustenance back to where it once was, people are going to follow him, and they will forfeit personal freedom to do so. That'll ultimately include taking the mark of the beast. The stage is being set for it. I don't say that this is it. I'm simply saying the constellation of world events, of which the coronavirus is only one part, is coming together to prepare the way for the advent of Antichrist. This is what's happening. These things are of prophetic significance. Now, I'm not a scaremonger. I'm not saying the Antichrist will be here next year or something like this. He's going to show his hand within the next 6 months. I'm simply saying the constellation of events are preparing the way for it, and people's willing to forfeit their freedom. But just one further thing.
Yeah.
Jesus said, before these things happen, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you.
Right.
The persecution of the church and the numbers of Christians who've been martyred in the last 50 to 60 years is higher than in all of history. And now we are beginning to see a crackdown on Christian rights and freedom
And that's
in
a
the
good
Protestant democracies.
That's a good point too, because it's very easy in the Western world to lose sight of the fact that persecution is very heavy in other parts of the world, and there's this myopic view, or there can tend to be in Western Christendom, that what's happening in Christianity is only what's happening here, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, that fuels the myth of the pre-tribulationists.
Right.
Only Christians in China, and only Christians, in Sudan, and only Christians in Saudi Arabia and Iran have to suffer. We live in California, we're going to be raptured.
Right.
We live in England, we're going to be raptured. That's the mentality of it.
Yeah, it really does skew. There's this double-edged sword where you're grateful for the blessings that we enjoy as a result of people spilling their blood for us to have these liberties. And on the other hand, I think I've heard you say before, real Christians obviously exist in America, but if you want to see real Christianity, go to a place where persecution is on the rise and see their faith being worked out. But something you mentioned is a really good point. I think with the advent of this, with this unprecedented response and the world kind of coming to a halt, perhaps like never before, we've seen a means by which this first seal could be broken, and we've seen a scenario that is going to require some problem solving, and you can see how a situation like coronavirus, perhaps coronavirus, but maybe not. Maybe it'll be something else similar to this. But for the first time, practically, we've seen a situation where you can see this man on the white horse coming in to resolve a problem of such magnitude.
Yeah, only I don't see it just as plague. I see it as a combination of plague, famine, war.
Well, and that's one of the things that analysts are talking about is, and I'll read a clip here in just a second, which just ties into What we're talking about, there's a group called the Global Pandemic Monitoring Board.
Yes.
They held a convention in September of 2019. I believe it was in
It's
Geneva.
basically the World Bank and the World Health Organization and their adjuncts.
It is co-convened by the World Health Organization and the World Bank. And two of their board, or well, let's just mention a couple of their board members would be the Director General for the Chinese CDC, the Executive Director for UNICEF, Dr. Anthony S. Fauci, who's advising in the White House now, and Dr. Chris Elias, who is the president of the Global Development Program for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Yes.
These just a couple of the players. But one of the articles that was published by, I think this is by Reuters, September 17th, 2019, as a result of their report, it says here, the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, co-convened by the World Bank and the World Health Organization, warned that epidemic-prone viral diseases like Ebola, flu, and SARS are increasingly tough to manage in a world dominated by lengthy conflicts, fragile states, and forced migration. Quote, "The threat of a pandemic spreading around the globe is a real one," the group said in a report released on Wednesday. "A quick-moving pathogen has the potential to kill tens of millions of people," and here, listen to this, "disrupt economies and destabilize national security." They're already talking about the potential of being ill-prepared for a wartime situation. That this could, this is gonna destabilize our entire national security.
Yes.
And other analysts have talked about how war could result. I mean, when you're in a room with two hungry people and somebody gets frustrated, that's bad enough. When the whole world's frustrated, things are kind of on edge right now, and you can see how conflicts could easily escalate in a situation like this.
Absolutely. Again, it'll be a combination of events. We are told this in the book of Revelation again, chapter 6. It lists these things with the first three horsemen individually.
Right.
But when the fourth horseman comes, that is the ashen one, I looked and behold an ashen horse, and he who sat on it had the name of Death and Hades, was following with him. Authority was given to them over a fourth of the earth. Now this is like the bubonic plague, that proportion.
Right.
To kill with sword, wars, famine, and pestilence.
Right.
And by the wild beasts of the earth, which is another issue. Now, this is incredible. It'll be a combination of things that will drive people to this point of desperation, and you know what they're going to do. Mm-hmm. Remember, Satan has the nations deceived. Satan has unbelieving Israel deceived. He's trying to deceive the true church. The word faith money preachers who've told people they don't have to suffer because of their faith, they're king's kids, name it and claim it, blab it and grab it, God wants you rich. They've been set up for this deception. Mm-hmm. Pre-tribulationism has set people up for this. The purpose-driven lie has set people up for this. The world, Satan has them blind. He's trying to deceive the true church. And he's been very, very successful. Very successful.
It's staggering to see some of the things that have happened in recent years. But kind of finally, let's take a look at a couple of, we mentioned a couple of these board members of the Global Pandemic Monitoring Board. Two of those individuals are also were also players in another organization. We're going to look at a few organizations that are all kind of tied together, but in conjunction with some other things we've talked about in terms of global currency and so forth. There's this. And many people have talked about this, but there's a program called ID 2020, and their goal is to basically provide a digital identification for everybody in the globe. And they frame it. They have an alliance manifesto, a 10-point manifesto, and the very first statement is, The ability to prove one's identity is a fundamental and universal human right. So this is framed
as a human right.
as a human right, and something that you're basically being deprived of, and that
Yes.
they're here to supply to you.
That's right.
Which, some people have maybe jumped a little too far ahead in making the statement, "This is the mark of the beast," which that's an irresponsible statement.
Yes.
But there's no denying that this is clearly, at the very least, some kind of predecessor to it, or providing
it's leading that way. If you look at what it actually is, they are using health, inoculation, as a vehicle to get people to be willing to accept an inserted microchip.
Right.
It's not being used for economic purposes. No mention of the name of the beast yet. But it's a step in that direction.
Right.
It's like anything else in the hands of fallen man. When fallen man is not subordinated to Christ, anything he can use for evil, he ultimately will. I've said this many times, you can use nuclear energy for isotopes to treat cancer, but you can use it for weapons of mass destruction. Anything that can be used for good,
Right.
fallen man will use for evil, unless he is under the control of the love and authority of Christ, because the world is in the power of the wicked one.
Right.
You're seeing the way this technology is going. They'll make a good argument. Right. This is for inoculation. It's for public health. It's for controlling pestilence. It's for protecting people. It's to your interest. It's to your advantage.
Right.
But it's setting the stage for the Antichrist. Again, take your shoes off. Let us search. Take your computer out to get on an airplane. Don't have a separate line for foreign nationals, or don't security profile Muslim passengers like El Al does in Israel. Instead, single out your own citizens along with everyone else. But it's for your own good. No, it's not. It's for my own bad. These people have an agenda, but it ultimately will be Satan's. I would just like to add one thing.
Yeah.
We haven't seen the EU, the post-Brexit European Union, playing a big role in this crisis. The countries in Europe are acting unilaterally. They are not acting in concert. You've got major problems in Spain and Italy. Countries like Germany are desperately trying to fight it off. The countries are acting unilaterally. They're not acting in concert. It's what Daniel chapter 2 said. The iron is not sticking to the clay. Now we have a post-Brexit Europe. This is a major, major sign that they will be desperate for an Antichrist to come to make the iron stick to the clay. This pandemic is highlighting, like nothing we've seen, the failure of Europe. Europe's inability to act in Yugoslavia and then relying on the Americans and British to do it, well, that showed it. But this really shows it. These countries are acting unilaterally as sovereign states with sovereign governments. They're not acting as a federal European state. The iron is not sticking to the clay. This exactly fulfills Daniel's prophecy, and it exactly shows why they need an Antichrist to make the iron stick to the clay. This should not be overlooked.
Yeah, that's a good point. There are 1,000 problems, and everybody's looking for a solution.
The other thing, though, again, I look to the other things that have changed the world in recent decades. The world's never been the same. 2008, September 11th, and now the coronavirus.
Right.
Each case, there was warnings that were ignored. For instance, the filmmaker Steve Emerson made films that he made it clear there was going to be an attack in the United States by radical Islamic terrorists. It's going to happen. Much the same as Billy Mitchell foretold Pearl Harbor nearly 20 years before it happened in some detail. Steve Emerson foretold September 11th. The Israeli government was trying to warn Western governments, including the United States, that a September 11th was going to happen, and they've been trying to do that without success for years. because the American government was too busy licking the boots of the Saudi Arabians, the way the Clintons did and do, and the Bush dynasty. There was signs. There was a great film, true film. I don't watch many films, but I do watch serious ones, called The Big Short. The Big Short showed there was some very shrewd investors managing hedge funds who knew the subprime was going to collapse, and they knew how to short the market, and they did it successfully. They saw the signs, but only a minority saw the signs, and they cleaned up in 2008 because they saw the signs. So too with the coronavirus. As you know, in October of last year, the Gates Foundation, in association with Johns Hopkins University and various other institutions, had a mock scenario.
A simulation, they say.
Simulation, yeah. Right. Planning for exactly what's happening now only a matter of months ago. Why were they doing that? There's always signs before these things happen,
right?
But the signs are generally ignored. Now, that's the world.
Right.
My problem is there's signs of what's happening in the church,
right?
And they're being ignored by most Christians. The world, we expect it.
Right.
But Christians, that day should not overtake us like a thief.
Exactly. And as you just mentioned that, what I want to do is we'll play a clip of this. There's a highlight reel. It was called, when I was first apprised of this, I didn't want to pay attention to it because it sounds a little hokey, it sounds conspiratorial, and so I ignored it until I just kept being bombarded with messages about this event 201, which as you said was sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, World Economic Forum, and Johns Hopkins. The specificity with which this simulation played out is eerie, is the best way I can put it. It's disturbingly specific, and added to that is that it was filmed October 18th of 2019, published November 4th of 2019, a full 2.5 months before the first reported case of coronavirus at the end of December. And the simulation specified a novel coronavirus, which was a term that was used only in medical circles. This was never in popular public vernacular. So I'm going to go ahead and play a few minutes of this clip, and keep in mind that the players in this simulation are real people. These are their actual titles, one of whom is the Director General of the Chinese CDC. Of course, the president of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You've got former CIA intelligence officers and so forth. 15 power players in the global on the global stage, and I think it was an audience of about 130 that was by invite only. So we'll go ahead and play this brief clip.
It began in healthy-looking pigs, months, perhaps years ago. A new coronavirus spread silently within herds. Gradually, farmers started getting sick. Infected people got a respiratory illness with symptoms ranging from mild flu-like signs to severe pneumonia. The sickest required intensive care. Many died. Experts agree, unless it is quickly controlled, it could lead to a severe pandemic, an outbreak that circles the globe and affects people everywhere.
The mission of the Pandemic Emergency Board is to provide recommendations to deal with the major global challenges arising in response to an unfolding pandemic. The board is comprised of highly experienced leaders from business, public health, and civil society.
We could be looking at double the number of cases in 1 week and 16 times as many in a month if we are not able to stop the spread. That would be on the order of 500,000 cases, and it would continue to rise exponentially. In 3 months, we could be approaching 10 million cases.
Public health agencies have issued travel advisories, while some countries have banned travel from the worst affected areas. As a result, the travel sector is taking a huge hit. Travel bookings are down 45%, and many flights have been canceled. A ripple effect is racing through the service sector. Governments that rely on travel and tourism as a large part of their economies are being hit particularly hard.
So at the moment, we want the funds, right? You need the money. So where's the money? So government kind of supplies some money. A lot of, private sectors, some are sitting here, you have some money. But now you need a really coordinated, centralized efforts.
Governments need to be willing to do things that are out of their historical perspective, or for the most part, it's really a war footing that we need to be on.
Countries are reacting in different ways as to how best to manage the overwhelming amounts of dis and misinformation circulating over the internet. In some cases, limited internet shutdowns are being implemented to quell panic.
How much control of information should there be, and by whom? And how can false information be effectively challenged? And what if that false information is coming from companies or from governments?
We're at a moment where the social media platforms have to step forward and recognize the moment to assert that they're a technology platform and not a broadcaster is over. They, in fact, have to be a participant in broadcasting accurate information and partnering with the scientific and health communities to counterweight, if not flood the zone, of accurate information, because to put the genie back in the bottle of the misinformation and disinformation is nigh impossible.
One thing we haven't spoken about, and I'm wondering whether it's time to talk about this, is a step up from the part of the governments on enforcement actions against fake news.
We do have, I think, a couple of strategies that are available to us, one of which is the flood strategy. But we also need to actually think about a technological answer to this.
The outcome of the CAPS pandemic in Event 201 was catastrophic. 65 million people died in the first 18 months. The outbreak was small at first and initially seemed controllable, but then it started spreading in densely crowded and impoverished neighborhoods of megacities. From that point on, the spread of the disease was explosive. Within 6 months, cases were occurring in nearly every country. The global economy was in a free fall. The GDP down 11%. Stock markets around the world plummeted between 20 and 40% and headed into a downward cycle of fear and low expectation. So, are we as a global community now finally ready to do the hard work needed to prepare for the next pandemic?
Some of the things that they talked about there, Jacob, included not only specifically a coronavirus, world travel bans, which we'd never seen before. They talked about the censorship of fake news and potentially shutting down the internet. Now, of all the things that they predicted there, only 2 of them haven't happened yet, and that is the epilogue, which said it started out manageable and then led to 65 million deaths. God forbid that should happen, but that's what their simulation said. The other one is internet shutdowns, which, at least in the Western world, we haven't seen yet, but they're already talking about how they're going to combat what they call fake news.
I was in China when there was an internet shutdown by the Chinese government all throughout China. It was during a party conference. They shut it down. Now, understand what they mean by fake news is not what we call fake news. Mm-hmm. Fake news to them is disagreeing with the party line. It's very much like Sovietism, where you had Pravda and Izvestia. Mm-hmm. Truth is what the party decided was truth, not what was objectively, factually the truth. Right. Truth is what was officially defined. So, for instance, you will say, Islam is a religion of peace and tolerance. That's the party line. Right. Okay, of the 51 or 53 Islamic countries in the world, can you show me one where Christians and Jews have the same rights and freedoms that Muslims have in Western countries, including Israel? Not one. You're not allowed to say that. That's not part of the party line. Right. It's just the way it is. You have to subscribe to the narrative. Mm-hmm. That's the way it is. What they mean by fake news is something different. I've seen this kind of close down. The Chinese government, from where Corona came, has already done it. I was there when they did it. Secondly, make no mistake about it, people like Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, they are in bed with the deep state. They are in bed with the intelligence community up to their eyeballs. Most people are naive to the fact that there are not three branches of government as ordained by the Constitution. It is not just the congressional cum legislative, the executive or the presidential, and the judiciary. It's not just the judicial, the congressional, and the executive. The Federal Reserve is an unelected fourth branch of government with more power than the Treasury, and it's controlled by the banking institutions it supposedly regulates. So you got a fourth branch of government. Fifth branch of government is the deep state. It's what the political philosopher and brilliant mathematician Steinmetz predicted. Steinmetz was a brilliant mathematician who came up with a mathematical model to explain alternating current, invented by Tesla. He was a brilliant man, but he was a political philosopher, and he saw the deep state coming. He said foreign and defense policies are going to be chiefly in the hands of secret intelligence organizations from the mid-20th century onward. He saw the deep state. And I assure you, social media is definitely in bed with deep state.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure, I think Zuckerberg's even on record as confirming that he's, partnered with the CIA to some extent. One of the directors of the CIA a few years back said, never in our wildest dreams did we envision such a useful tool as Facebook. And in fact, right after the coronavirus, one of the first joint conference calls that came out was between Mark Zuckerberg and Dr. Anthony Fauci, saying that Facebook was standing ready to combat anything that they deemed fake news, which was a bizarre thing to simulate in conjunction with a coronavirus. And I do want to point out something which ties a lot of this together. That, again, you have the World Economic Forum sponsoring this with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. When you go back to the ID 2020, the founding partners include, but are not limited to, but include three of the founding partners are Microsoft, the Rockefeller Foundation, and a group called Gavi, which is a vaccine alliance. Gavi is comprised of four core partners, including the World Bank, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and again, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So you can see that one of the founding partners that is supporting the digital identity of the globe includes these same entities we've been talking about that are also part of the world, the Global Pandemic Monitoring Board that did this simulation, which can only be described as nearly prophetic. And again, you can see these power players, these political unelected officials that are making decisions really for the world already, informally. But something that we talked about just a second ago, and we'll tie all this up in just a moment, is the idea of famines being a result of maybe what we haven't traditionally anticipated. Because in America, if there's a drought in America, it doesn't really affect the production of food. You have man-made irrigation systems that will compensate for that. It's not like a famine was 200 years ago when you're really dependent on the rain or whatever river you might happen to live by. And so, but we can see how the halt of distribution would create a de facto famine. People don't have access to food. It's a famine. And while we don't want to over-speculate, I can't help but taking into account some of the things that we just saw and heard in that video. Is it even possible that, because Jesus said pestilences would come, but he didn't say by what or by whom they would come?
Correct.
Is it even possible that that there's such a thing as a manufactured pestilence? That we can't rule that out, can we?
Well, in history, there have been manufactured famines.
Right.
Mengistu did it in Ethiopia. He used starvation as a military weapon against his own population, as Stalin used it against the Ukrainians 3 times. There have been manufactured famines. Why wouldn't there be manufactured pestilences using bacteriological agents? The potential to do it began in World War I. It's just was mutually assured destruction, so it's never happened on a large scale. But the technology has been around for at least 3 generations.
I mean, that's how LSD came about. Lysergic acid,
Sure,
acid was
absolutely.
used as a war tool to disorient the enemy and so forth.
LSD-25 was developed by a company called Sandoz, and it was experimented by the Pentagon and by the CIA. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and Bill Gates was recently talking about what he would do if he were president, and I'm not saying that he's anything more than he is, but it is interesting. You already have a prominent figure like Bill Gates who has casually talked about eugenics and wanting to decrease the global population by 10 to 15%. He said this 10 years ago in a TED Talk. I'm not making that up. That's exactly what he said. And he said that they could do it through the proper use of vaccines and so forth. Please look it up. But you can already see people calling for global government, other people stepping in saying, if you only had me, I would have these problems never would have befallen you. And, interestingly enough, the same guy that's talking about solving our problems seems to have his hand in a lot of different areas that are really difficult to overlook. And that simulation is one of the more disturbing videos I've seen. But be that as it may, we want to be aware of these things, but ultimately not consumed by them. Because we want to be consumed by God's word. We want to be consumed by obedience to Him. And I know you've talked a lot about, maybe you're going to expound on this concept just briefly, the light to heavy concept and how that is.
Light to heavy was a principle of Midrash, Kal v'homer. What's true in a general or light situation takes on an expanded dimension of importance and a heavy one. For instance, forsake not the fellowshipping together one with another. Fellowship is always important, Hebrews 10:25, especially as you see the day approaching. What we're seeing here with this coronavirus, Christians are not being able to assemble, except by internet means that can be controlled by powers that have antithetical interests to Christianity.
And they're already talking about shutting the internet down potentially.
Yes.
We might see that.
Yes. However, there is a big caveat. We're told in Daniel, the little horn, the Antichrist will come to power in part by conspiracy. Jesus was betrayed by a conspiracy within the Sanhedrin and with the Roman government. No one says there's not conspiracies. There were conspiracies at the first coming of Christ. There will be with the second coming of Christ. But we are warned in Isaiah concerning the coming of Christ. In chapter 8, there'll be an increase in occult activity and an increase in conspiracies. We're told this in Isaiah chapter 8, do not call a conspiracy. All these people call a conspiracy. We have purely secular conspiracy theorists. Sometimes these people are psychotic. Sometimes these people actually have nervous breakdowns and become delusional. There's been clinically documented cases reported in the American Journal of Psychiatric Medicine where you've had people who are conspiracy theorists who actually became clinically diagnosed as psychotic. They have a problem. In a conspiracy theory, there's always some element of truth or fact in it.
Right.
However, that becomes amplified out of proportion, from which they then extrapolate things by conjecture. They conjecture things and extrapolate those things from something that has some measure of truth. And it becomes something that is speculative, but treated as fact. Now, these secular conspiracy theorists exist. Just go online and look at the Kennedy assassination. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of them.
Right.
However, they get into the church thinking themselves to be dealing with end-time prophecy and or discernment.
Mm-hmm.
They think of themselves as having discernment ministries or some kind of end-time prophetic teaching ministry. But they call a conspiracy all these people call conspiracy. How do we know? Where do we draw the line? The scriptures speak of conspiracies, but we're not to call everything a conspiracy that people say is a conspiracy. Well, stay scriptural. Everybody knows there was a thing called Illuminism that was absorbed into Freemasonry with Felix Weishaupt. Everybody knows that 32nd and 33rd degree Freemasons have gotten saved and have left Freemasonry, disclosing the views of Albert Pike and disclosing that they had a counterfeit of the Trinity, Yabalon.
Right.
Yahweh, Osiris, and Baal. Okay. Everybody knows Jesus said, let no one bind you as an oath. And when you become a Mason, you take a blood oath.
Right.
Everybody knows those things. No Christian should be involved in Freemasonry. They should burn their aprons. It is a cult practice. They have a false Trinity. It is interfaith. You've got Islamic Masons. You've got Protestant Masons. You've got many kind of Mason. No Christian, saved Christian, should be involved with it. Let it go at that. Right. Don't get into these things about the Illuminati or conspiring to bring Antichrist to power. No. Satan is conspiring to bring Antichrist to power.
Right.
These people in the political and corporate realm are merely his stooges.
Right.
They don't know what's going on. Most people join Freemasonry at the lower degrees for business contacts or for social reasons or to participate in charitable projects like the Shriners. They have nothing to do with what Freemasonry ultimately is. They don't know. Don't get caught up in conspiracy theories. Don't get into speculations. Emphasize what the Bible does.
Right.
Where does the Bible emphasize worrying about the Illuminati? Where does the Bible emphasize worrying about a lot of these things Christians are taken up in? Don't.
Right.
Put the emphasis where the scripture does.
Yeah, it's a great point, and with the light to heavy concept, if prayer is especially important in general, perhaps it's especially important now. If praying for wisdom
Amen.
is always important, it's especially important now. And wherever we are or were, what I can say is we have appeared to shift a gear somewhere along this. This is a new gear and a new mode of existence. Whatever that means or what might play out, we don't know. But we do know that things are changed. They've changed definitively, and the globe will forever be impacted by what we're dealing with now. And it appears that a lot of things are lining up, and we need to really saturate ourselves in prayer and to keep ourselves gird up the loins of your mind. And
yes.
Perhaps let me just share a verse from Luke 21. In verse 28, Jesus says, now when you see these things begin to happen, look up and lift up your heads, because
Amen.
your redemption draws near. As we both know, Jesus can come for any one of us at any time.
Amen.
We should always be ready. But when we see these things begin to happen, hopefully, prayerfully, an extra measure of sobriety will come about us and cause
Amen.
us to work while it's day, right?
Absolutely. Yet at a time when we should be the most sober, we've had false teachers and false prophets telling us we should, as it were, get drunk. People like Rodney Howard Brown and people like this and Kenneth Copeland with the deceptions that came out of Toronto and Pensacola. Again, when God is warning of something, Satan will always attack it from within the church. He will get messengers within the church. Joel, chapter 1, verse 5, awake ye drunkards, be sober, says Joel.
Amen.
Rodney Howard Brown says, drinking at Joel's place. Book of Acts, these men are not drunk with wine. They heard the mighty deeds of God. No, they heard inebriated hysterics.
Right.
This is the working of Satan in the church. We cannot stop the world from being deceived because the world is deceived already. It is saved Christians who are not to be deceived.
Right. And Satan's going to be working overtime, no doubt.
Yes.
The Bible does say deceiving, if possible, even the elect. And boy, do we need to pray for wisdom. And we know that God promises to give it liberally to those who ask for it.
Amen. The world has not been the same since September 11th.
Right.
The world has not been the same since 2008. And the world is not going to be the same after the corona pandemic. But you know what? There's going to be more to come.
Right.
This is not the first, and it's not going to be the last.
The good news is that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So,
Amen.
Jacob, we really do appreciate you joining us, and perhaps we'll catch up again in the future. We encourage everybody to pay attention to these things, but to take heed. I believe it says also in Luke's Gospel to by patience possess your souls. By patience. And lift up your heads and look up and make use of the time you have. There's opportunities for evangelism, perhaps like never before, not in recent times. So make use of the time. You can, of course, find Jacob at Moriel TV and moriel.org. Jacob, our blessings to you. And until next time, everybody, God bless and Godspeed.
Every blessing in Jesus.
Amen.